I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tiarra Maznick. She is the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University's Assistant Director and the Weinberg Postdoctoral Associate. Dr. Maznick joined the foundation following her dissertation, Jewish Women's Wombs, the Holocaust and Post-War Pronatalism. At UMass Amherst, she received her bachelor's in German Studies and Russian Civilization from Smith College in 2010, followed by her master's degree in German Studies and a graduate certificate in Advanced Feminist Studies at UMass and Amherst 2020. As a scholar of reproduction under Nazism, Maznick researches sterilization, eugenics, reproductive politics, and pronatalism during and after the Holocaust. Our current project focuses on abortions in displaced persons camps, sterilizations in Ravensbrück concentration camp, and sensory-based experiences of Nazi persecution. This is going to be a difficult topic. It will be a hard subject. So please, everyone, again, if you need to step out for a second, if you need to take a pause for a moment, feel free if you need to. But I'd like to hand it over to her. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Dr. Maznick. I'll turn it over to you now. A very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, folks. All right, so I will go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, perfect. All right. So to reiterate what Stephen said, Mr. Pointer, if anyone needs to step out, feel free. This is officially the trigger warning that there'll be something sexual or graphic in content. So first I'll introduce myself. I'm Tiarra Maznick, as you know, and I come from Massachusetts, where I did my bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And I'm a New England native transplanted to Evanston, so near Chicago. Today I'll be talking about a specific set of Nazi human experiments, specifically the experimental sterilization as practiced on women in two select camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau and Ravensbrück. So to kind of get an idea of where we're going today, first we'll do a Jamboard to kind of take stock of what we know and why this is important. And then we'll go through certain facets of the experiments. So to say the purpose, the perpetrators, methods, place, and settings, and then some of the survivors. And we'll look throughout about different ways that we can incorporate this into the classroom, if at all. I understand that certain age demographics this might not be suitable for, say younger children. But something I'd like for us to keep in mind as we proceed through the material is that there's often a certain negotiation between practicality and ideology of the regime. And sometimes these two things dovetailed, sometimes they competed, sometimes they were negotiated, but they were two driving principles, if you will, to this conquest of race and space. And we'll get more into that. So to start, if folks are familiar with Jamboard, you can take out your phone or your iPad and scan this QR code. And so I'll give folks a few minutes to scan that QR code. And the first question will look at, what do you know about these experiments, about any Nazi experiments, and why this is important? So I'll give folks a minute to scan the QR code, and after you scan it, then I'll pull up the Jamboard on the screen so you can see the answers as they populate. So I'll give folks a minute to scan. All right, so I'll go ahead and I'll open the Canva on my side, the Jamboard. So the first question on the board, don't worry, I won't go through them yet. The first question is, what can we learn when we study these experiments? What can they tell us?
Just real quick, this is might be a little difficult on phones
Sure.
because the screen size. I know some people are struggling a little bit with some of the phone pieces, so just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. I hope folks don't mind. I'm moving the text around a little bit just to unclog the traffic jam. It's tricky with phones, I acknowledge. What I can also do, there's one more Jamboard at the end, and what I could do is put that link into the chat part of the Zoom so folks can do it on their computers. That might be a little bit easier in terms of mechanics.
That would be perfect.
All right. So kind of surveying the space what we have populating so far is a lot of it has to do with the depravity of the Nazi regime, right? So it looks like how far they were willing to go. And so it looks like this, in this context, it speaks about, this litmus test of barbarity, how far they were willing to go. Um, and in addition to that, there's many facets that we can learn about the experiments that can teach us about, say, for instance, the connection between the nation state and Nazism, or the nation and Nazism, about the connection between medicine and ideology. Excellent. Someone mentioned here how it applies to the sterilization practices today against women. That's something that I bring together when I teach in women's studies courses and I teach about eugenics. That's something that I incorporate definitely. Yeah, the thought process behind why the experiments happened. We'll be talking about that a little bit as well. Just a few more seconds and then we'll move on to the second bit. And I'm wondering if the second question on here, if it might be easier for folks to verbally contribute. That might be that might be an option here. All right. So so it looks here. Oop, there it is. Moving these texts around. um, yes, so we can understand sterilizations as a control of population, so to say, of selective control of population, and as one form of eugenic intervention. And eugenics, in long and in short, is controlling reproduction, whether positively or negatively, using hard approaches or soft approaches, but having the control over a people's reproductive capacities. So the second question here, and we can verbally contribute. would be what do you know about the Nazi experiments? What are you familiar with? And
So
this can be,
if anybody
sorry,
wants
go
to,
ahead.
if anyone online wants to unmute themselves after she asks I just want to say if you want to verbally contribute, just wait until she lets you go, and then anybody in the audience here would like to contribute, I will bring the microphone to you. So once the question's posed.
So is it okay to talk, or are you doing the people in person?
See, I feel like I'm like segregating people. Yes, I'll be happy. If you, is it okay, Tiara, to let the folks know?
Sure,
Go ahead.
absolutely.
Yeah, so I tell the story of a survivor from Hungary. She had experiments done on her in Auschwitz, where they put drops in her eyes.
Mhm.
And I think they were maybe trying to change the color of their eyes. And she had to stand in like a dark room for days. And the girls that came out that were blind were killed immediately after. And she could see. It was blurry, but she could still see. So her life was spared.
Yeah.
So a personal story that I know.
We'll be able, once we look at the experiments a little bit, we can see that is one of the personal research agendas. That was from Josef Mengele, and he was looking at heterochromia, or eyes of two different colors. And so he was kind of manipulating to see if he could change color in the eyes, if there was something particular to them. Um, but yeah, we'll be looking at those as one of his personalized research agendas, but definitely one of the more overlooked experiments, I would say. Thank you for sharing that.
Uh,
I have a question.
Sure.
What's the rationale behind sterilizing a woman versus, like, I mean, if they were essentially killing so many people, I just don't understand what was the purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't understand.
Yeah, we'll get to this in a little bit, but I'll briefly answer that now. So the women that were sterilized experimentally were not sterilized for the purpose of sterilizing them, but rather to perfect a method that they were hoping to apply elsewhere. So they were using them as human guinea pigs. Um, in terms of kind of this larger hierarchy of human life, quote unquote, Aryans are at the top, and it's kind of stratified, right? There's different levels of value attributed to human life. And so Jewish folks were at the bottom of this totem that, destined for death, etc. But for folks who were permitted to live and not reproduce, such as Slavs and Poles, they were hoping to use this on them so that they could extort their labor and have them not be able to reproduce. So it's still this race in space, right? So as they were going to be taking more land, shaping what the population looks like on that land. So the women that were sterilized in the camps, that was purely for scientific refinement and experimentation for broader application elsewhere. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
anybody else in here in person?
The experiments with twins, when he would experiment on one and use the other one as a control.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll briefly mention the Ava Moses core, but yeah, she was one of the twins, and that those were experiments by Josef Mengele. They call him the Angel of Death, but I find that moniker far too generous. He was not an angel. Yeah.
If anybody online would like to pipe in.
Sure. We'll take one more and then we'll move forward.
I think that might be it.
That's it. All right. So we will go ahead and continue onward. All right. So to kind of frame this moving forward, So we understand that the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, there were many different forms, right? There's forced labor, there's death, there's starvation, torture, murder. And so we consider experimental medicine as one of these many different atrocities, right? And to give context to this very briefly, is that Germany was a global leader in medicine and in the sciences in the 20s. They had a flourishing eugenics movement. And many eugenicists in Germany were in communication with those in the US, whether via correspondence in the mail, they would send each other publications, they'd see each other at conferences, they exchanged ideas. And it was actually California's sterilization program that Nazi Germany modeled their own sterilization law after in 1933, right after they took power. So one of the first things they did was pass legislation for sterilization. They had long admired the program we had in California. But due to World War II and these tensions ramping up, this communication stopped. But Germany was still nevertheless deeply invested in furthering science and medicine, and sought to continue to be a prominent leader in science and medicine. And so the whole design of the concentration camp was intended to house, enemies of the people or enemies of the nation, and also to extort labor. But they've been described as these exceptional places outside of the law. And so in many ways, these experiments that happen there couldn't happen elsewhere in a regular medical facility, right? Not like the way they did. Instead, it was sanctioned by law as as poorly designed as that law may have been. It was under the patina of law. But what we see happening in the camps is very rogue. Folks can, I mean, ultimately do whatever they would like with very little consequence, including killing prisoners, right? But in this way, what couldn't happen elsewhere was happening in camps as these sites of exception. And one of the reasons why this is still so important is that some of the lessons that we've learned from in those camps or from some of those physicians or other Nazi-affiliated physicians have translated and still carry over today. For instance, Karl Klauberg, we'll speak about him momentarily, but he's known as the father of the birth control pill. He invented certain synthetic hormones and progesterone, and so he's considered the father of the birth control pill, and he sterilized hundreds of Jewish women. So we still live with these legacies, so there's still lots of relevance to today and to the here and now. Yeah, and to revisit this whole ideology and practicality, well, we'll do that in the next slide. So the purpose of the experiments, can anyone tell me perhaps in looking at this map, what we see, what process we see happening in this map? I'll give folks a moment. So if you can't read the fine print, it says Greater Germany, 1944. What do you see this process of? We see I'll slowly lead us there. We see the color coding, right? So I'll help us along here. Nazi Germany sought to occupy the East, right? That was the grand master plan, the Generalplan Ost, the plan for the East. And we can think about the war as it extended into, say, France and Belgium as a way to prevent them from attacking Nazi Germany as they pushed eastward. It was really a preventative measure so they couldn't be taken off guard, they couldn't be attacked while they were doing this. The real plan was to expand eastward. And so they imagined as they were pushing eastward, they're developing things as they go. in how they want to proceed. And so a part of this plan in going eastward was race and space, right? So space is taking this land and race is deciding who will be on it. And so they envisioned sterilizing Eastern European laborers, slave workers, slave labor, sterilizing and then continuing to use their labor. Now, obviously, this is, I think, obviously it's a short-term measure because then if they can't reproduce, who will be the slave labor, right? But a lot of things were developed as they proceeded, and they would revisit their plans and change them accordingly. But that was the plan for that time being, was sterilizing and pushing eastward. And what they really sought to do was the regular sterilizations in doctors' offices were expensive, they were slow. It took time for someone to recover, they would have to stay in the hospital. And so it was just really time and cost intensive. And they were thinking, okay, how can we make this cheap and fast and easy? Those were like the key guiding things. So ideology said we can sterilize these people, and practicality said, how can we make this quick and efficient, and as seamless as possible? Are there any questions about this so far? And remember, there's no shame in not knowing what you don't know. And I am happy to answer any question at any point in time during the presentation. Feel free to let me know. You can also message me, and I'm glad to address it because if it's a question you have, it's likely that someone else has it too, right?
What do you mean by ideally without subject knowledge?
Sure. Yeah, so we will see that in a moment, but Horst Schumann was hoping to sterilize. He was trying to think about ways of sterilizing without someone knowing. And he was the one that worked with X-ray radiation. And so he actually, I'll kind of describe it more in a moment, but he would sit behind a lead booth or in a lead booth, and he'd have someone come up under the pretenses of filling out a form. So they would stand there and stand there and they'd write and they'd hear the humming of this machine and not realize that they were being sterilized. And so they were hoping, okay, we can avoid the fight and the kerfuffle and the protest if they don't know. And so for them, it's really just this ease of process without any hiccups or resistance.
So would that include just Jewish or any kind of a member of the population? I'm just thinking, for example, members of or targeted by the T4 program, or if you were like in a physical condition or a illness situation or anything like that, like who would be included in that group?
A really excellent question. So the folks in care facilities that were subject to T4, that was the gassing program, the quote unquote euthanasia program. Those were folks who the state envisioned to be long-term charges. And so they figured they would have to pay for their long-term care indefinitely. And that they would call them ballast existence, and people who are ballasts or weights to society. And for folks that were in facilities that weren't necessarily long-term, they could, in some capacity, work and earn and have some sense of normalcy under their visions. They could be sterilized but left alive because they wouldn't have to pay for their long-term care. And for this method in particular, it was for the people that they would encounter as they pushed eastward. So Jews, either which way, depending on the point in time in the war, could have been gassed or used for labor, depending on when in the war. The intention was to develop this for Eastern European laborers, not necessarily Jewish, but that could have changed as the situation changed as they pushed eastward. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Maznick, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you? Yeah. There's the sterilization program in the East. what demographic projections did the Germans have? Because if they sterilize a major part of the population within one generation, there would have, or two, there would have been no more slave workers.
Yeah.
How did they logically think they would counter that with a demographic push from their own superior race?
Yeah, it's not clear. It's not clear. I think this was kind of the grand plan, but I think something we see repeatedly with the regime is that they would stop and reassess and make plans according to where things stand. As far as I could see in the Generalplan Ost, they didn't really specify what that next step would be in terms of feasibility, right? Like how that would function, as you were saying, like if everyone was sterilized. They said only that it was intended for Eastern European laborers, but didn't really specify what the next step would be or what anything else would look like. Does that make sense? You're right. It is very short-sighted, and there's many instances, I think, in which we see the regime and we think like, wow, that's really counterintuitive, or these two things are, they contradict each other, and that happened relatively often. I hope that helps. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Perfect. So looking at this, we can also think in the classroom, depending on what level students you're teaching. It can springboard conversations into genocide, but also settler colonialism and what we do with reproduction when another, say, group or party, et cetera, or peoples are populating a country. Another example might be, and there's plenty from United States history, might be 1970s. A lot of Native American women in the US were sterilized in Indian healthcare facilities, medical facilities, over a few different states in the upper Midwest. But that was indigenous folks being sterilized without their knowledge. They would be told that they say have cancer, that they would have to have a hysterectomy in order to survive, when in fact that wasn't the case. So there was a lot of medical malpractice and lying about the conditions, but that is one of many instances that we see. But this can also be a springboard into some of those conversations. And if someone were to so choose out of their own prerogative, they could also look at different IVF practices and state supports in Israel and about how reproduction functions and serves in those spaces. So it's different in different contexts, but that might be a conversation that you could branch into from this. So moving on to 3 different types of experiments, and this helps us understand why, right? So the first category is military, there's racial goals, and then there's personal research agendas. And I think this will lend some framework to folks. These categories are developed by Paul Vineland, who is a prominent scholar who writes about human experimentation, racial hygiene, things of the like. So the big hubs of human experimentation were in 4 camps: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. So to start, the military-related experiments, these were all for their own military. And so they were trying to see, and these had a lot of real-life application. So the high-altitude experiments, they wanted to see their pilots, how high could their pilots fly without being inhibited? Cold temperatures, if a pilot were downed in the ocean, could they survive in the water, depending on how cold it was? This also played a role, right, in World War II when Nazi soldiers in the Soviet Union found it too cold and couldn't dig mass graves anymore and had to return after the ground thawed. So, we see them already encountering these cold conditions and having some trouble. And seawater consumption to see if their pilots, if they were downed in the ocean, if they could drink seawater, for how long, how much. etc. So all of these had direct translation to their own military. Racial goals. So I'm not sure if, can you see my cursor on the screen if I move my cursor? You can? Perfect. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. So this figure here is Horst Schumann, and this figure here is Karl Klauberg. They, in fact, hated each other and would rarely be in the same space together. So this is a very rare photo that captures both of them. And so the very broadly defined, the two sterilization experiments were radiation conducted by Horst Schumann and caustic injection by Karl Klauberg. Schumann, and I'll say in a moment how he did this, but he's responsible for around, we estimate 200 men being sterilized, and around 40 women. And he was kind of a minor player, if you will, when it came to sterilization. He didn't show up very often. He spent a very brief amount of time in the camp, but Klaubeck, however, was very central. He considered the block of sterilizations to be his block. Yeah, so he had ownership over it, and people respected the women in there as belonging to him, and he did pay for their human labor, not them, but the regime. So personal research agendas, we talked about this a little bit, but the personal research agendas really depended on that physician and what they wanted to uncover. So heterochromia was one of them, the eye colors that were different. Another one was the twin experiments. So these are the twin sisters, Miriam and Ava Moses. And Ava Moses' core here is on the right. She founded the Candles Museum in Indiana. And I actually met her son in Belgrade, in Serbia. He's a lovely, lovely man, but he told me some really funny stories about his mom, which don't have place here. But if you're ever really curious, I could tell you later. But the idea behind this, and someone had mentioned that one twin was a control, and this is absolutely true. And what this was getting at was that it was unclear to scientists at the time what role, it's this nature versus nurture, this age-old debate, right? If something is changed in a human, is it their genetic makeup? Is it their social environment, how they were raised, treated, etc.? And so he envisioned that with twins, that the hereditary part was the same for both. So if knowing this, that they're in the same beginning point, he can change the conditions to one of the twins, and the other one, right, is that control. And if one twin died, then the other one would die as well, because they no longer served a purpose for Mengele. But yeah, this was one of his research projects. Are there any questions about this thus far?
Yes. So in their minds, because a lot of these people, they were holding PhDs too. So in their minds, they were thinking they were improving the science of medicines in a sense.
Yeah, I would say contributing scientific knowledge, but I think for some of them too, I think the personal prestige and esteem was something that they sought. Klauberg in particular, he became famous through developing these synthetic hormones. And he was very well known in Germany at the time. And so he was hoping to experience continued success. He was also, I mean, dare I say, very full of himself. So I think he was also trying to do this for himself rather than for the regime very broadly, or medicine very broadly. But I think it depended on the person. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Sure. Are there any other questions on this?
Oh, yeah, I got one question here.
Sure.
Let me just hand the microphone. I'm in person. I was walking a microphone over.
Hi, I saw this echoed in the chat too, but in terms of sterilization by radiation, would that have taken an awful lot of radiation, and would that have any other kind of effects on them? I imagine they weren't just centralizing it on like sterilization at that point. It'd probably cause other effects. I was just wondering about that.
Sure. Yeah. I'll look at the procedure a little bit more momentarily, but to answer your question, it would take a lot of radiation. And Schumann came to the conclusion in mid 1944 that his method was very ineffective, and that in fact it was not. He would not recommend it above conventional methods. Um, and yes, there were a lot of off-site unintended effects, which was Schumann had no idea what he was doing. And so he really just over radiated in the beginning. So it killed all of the human tissue around the abdomen. So a lot of women, their skin turned black, men as well, and their scrotum and other private parts turned black because of the tissue damage. And in terms of long-term effects, we know right now there are some women, well, they've passed now, but who had colon cancer, different stomach cancers, all around these points of contact with radiation. So there were a lot of like long-term off-target effects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about his procedure in a second.
Dr. Maznick, sorry, I hate to ask these questions.
Please.
Are there actually today positive effects of any of the research was done, be it radiation, operation, anesthesia, and so on? Do we actually today profit of any of those researches?
That's an excellent question. Specifically for the sterilizations?
For example, or radiation for that matter?
No, we learned, I mean, the world learned some in terms of the experiments conducted for the military, but for sterilization, very little. I mean, Schumann was a very bad a bad physician beyond his moral transgressions, but scientists had already determined in the 1910s and 20s that X-ray radiation would cause infertility. So he was not actually contributing much of anything new. He was hoping to develop some fast, efficient method, but they had known long ago. So his in particular contributed close to nothing to medicine and science. Klauberg did contribute, but not through the sterilization. Through his synthesizing hormones is what he came to be known for. But the sterilizations themselves contributed very little. I mean, the long and the short of it is that they didn't want to do full hysterectomies because they were costly, took too long, and a lot of folks died from sepsis. Most of the deaths in the early years of sterilization in medical facilities, not even the experimental ones, but in regular traditional facilities, 95% of the deaths were women because they couldn't control sepsis after hysterectomies. So after the Nazi regime, folks would return to tubal ligation or, you know, in the most intensive scenarios, full hysterectomies.
May I mention one thing?
Sure.
I have read somewhere, and I'll try to find the article about the medical ethics behind even using any of these experiments for what may or may not be learned. I can't remember where I read that, but I know there's an article out there somewhere on medical ethics. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Dr. Maznick, I have one question for you.
Sure.
I don't know if there is any information on this, but have you come across in your research any adverse effects on the Nazi physicians who administered the radiation? Like, I imagine being around it all the time would have had some sort of effect on them, but I don't think I've ever heard of it having any impact on the doctors themselves.
No, they took precautions for themselves, and they also delegated dirty work. So for the radiation, Schumann would sit in a lead cabin. So he knew, I mean, he knew that it would be detrimental, and so he protected himself. And then as time went on, he would have prisoner physicians, so prisoner functionaries, prisoners who were given delegated tasks, so they had some authority and power. He would have them conduct the oophorectomies or castration, so they would do the surgeries for him. But he, as you'll see, he lived out his life. He never really faced any real consequences. I mean, he was extradited. We'll get into it, but he died of natural causes outside of any prison, and evaded culpability at every turn, as did Klauberg. So neither of them expressed any remorse, any regret, and neither had any physical impairments from what they had done.
That's hard to hear, but thank you for sharing.
Sure, absolutely. All right, so we'll move on. So in terms of the targets of these three different types of experiments, as you can imagine, those related to the military were predominantly conducted on men. Men were obviously the kind of the presumed soldier that they envisioned benefiting from this. An exception would be the quote unquote Ravensbrück rabbits. And those were the 74 Polish women, not Jewish, who had their legs mutilated. These are the pictures that you see, for instance, when you look at the Nuremberg trials and you see the leg with the scarring. It's the only physical evidence of damage that is presented at Nuremberg. The rest is mostly war trial documentation, perpetrator documentation. But the one human damage they demonstrate is of these women's legs. And essentially, a Nazi high head honcho had died from, I believe it was sepsis in his leg. There was an explosion. Long story short, they wanted to investigate if sulfa drugs would help women who had debris and infected wounds in their legs. And so they put wood and glass and other debris into the women's legs to see if they could prevent sepsis. So with the exception of those 74 women, the vast majority were men. And in terms of sterilization, that was predominantly women as well. Schumann experimented on some men and sent them back. But the women that all lived together in Block 10, those were, as I mentioned, all women. So the demographics of who was experimented on is largely men, but in the subset of reproduction, all women. Does this make sense? Just to give folks an idea of gender and how that plays into the human experiments. So the perpetrators, I won't spend too long on them because I don't think they deserve our time. I think we should focus on what happened to the women and the women's voices, but this story is also central to our study, right? So Horst Schumann, you can't see in this photo, maybe you can see an inkling of it. He has a scar on his face. Has anyone seen this before? Is anyone in German studies or anything like that has an idea? It's called a Schmiss. And long story short, the good old boys clubs in Germany and Austria, they would duel, and they would have their fencing sword, if you will, and they would gently cut each other on the cheek, and it was like this sign of like, I'm a man. Usually this happened with lots of alcohol consumption, but men of this time would have like a scar on their face from this fencing duel. And he had one as well. It was a sign of masculinity and bravery, and it was very common in the military. But long story short, he was an SS major in the Luftwaffe in the German Air Force. He showed up to Auschwitz in his uniform with his scar on his face. He looked very different from the other perpetrator we're looking at. And importantly, he headed one of the euthanasia facilities before this. And so he had already had practice in killing. So he headed that facility, and it was after that that he transitioned to human experiments at Auschwitz. As I mentioned before, he contributed close to nothing to medicine. Yeah, he was a very poor physician. He didn't know how much radiation would kill human tissue. He clearly wasn't aware of existing research in the medical field when it came to radiation. As to what happened, what happened to him, fall of 42 to fall of 43, the peak killing years, those were his peak years for experimentation. And then he stopped and he wrote a report in April of 44 saying, this isn't efficient, we shouldn't do this anymore. Traditional methods were easier. Then he left Auschwitz, and we know that he was a prisoner of war with the Americans, actually, in January of 45. And he was released later that year, got married to his physician's assistant, his PA, married her, and then had filed for a hunting license in East Germany after the war in 1951. And German authorities saw this and said, hey, he's on our list of guys that we're looking for. And he fled to Sudan. He saw that he was being hunted, so he went to Sudan by way of Egypt. A Holocaust survivor recognized him, and he fled again. And this time he went to Ghana. And he was extradited from Ghana in 1966. And about 4 years later, they put him on trial for the murder of 30,000. This is likely from either his selections at Auschwitz or the euthanasia killings, both of which many thousands of people died. So he faced trial in 1970 and was sentenced to prison. I'm not sure how long, but was released after 2 years because they said he was in poor health. And he died in 1983. He lived as a free man for 11 years after they released him from prison. So his experimental methods are not very sophisticated. He would radiate, as I mentioned before, he initially tried with this whole, the subject doesn't know what's happening to them and they walk up and they fill out a form. But I mean, they're moving around, they're writing on this form, they're doing all these things. It takes a long time. It's humming, it's loud. They realized it wasn't effective. So then they would just have someone stand there, put their abdomen up to this plate, have a plate behind their buttocks, and then they would be radiated. If they asked what was happening, he wouldn't answer them. He kept a pistol on him. If folks hid, which they would frequently try to do, or hide in the corner of the room, etc., he would keep them at gunpoint and force them to continue. After the X-ray, after a few weeks, he would have either one ovary or one testy removed, so he could examine it to see, was this effective, right? So looks at the ovary, says it's functioning or not, and then continue the process and remove the second one, if he got that far. Some folks had both gonads removed, some folks only one, but that was his process. The men he experimented on were mostly Greek and Polish, and the women were mostly Greek and Dutch. Are there any questions for this slide?
around the room. Anybody have any questions? No, we look like we're, anybody online?
All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
It was a half hand, but I'm gonna, my microphone running with hot coffee.
So I do have a question. My question is probably maybe not just for this slide and maybe for the next slide, but when it comes to like evidence-based practice, rules and regulations, board of like regulatory boards, were there not things like that in place, or there were and they just didn't care?
So there were not, but the whole medical field was transformed entirely after the atrocities of the Nazi regime and these medical malpractices. It changed the entire field, especially when it comes to consent and experimentation. So it definitely had a massive impact. German physicians, the ones that participated in this, claimed that they ran out of like rabbits and mice, and therefore it was necessary to use humans. But in some places and in some conditions, they would try and have the sterilization be under the patina of choice. So in Ravensbrück, for instance, Roma women were told, if you sign this to consent to be sterilized, we will release you. This was a lie. And so a lot of the women also were illiterate. So they would sign. It's very heart-wrenching to see these forms signed with X's or plus marks or circles because the women couldn't read. But they would try and say after the war, right, that the women signed, therefore it was consent, but it wasn't really consent, right? So it also prompted a lot of questions. What does consent look like in medical practices? That was also a big conversation that shaped the field afterwards. Yeah, and it's a part of why a lot of folks were kind of let off the hook afterwards, is that they claimed that these experimental methods were refined and therefore no longer experimental. And so if it's a refined conventional approach to sterilization, then therefore, in their words, this should be fine. And so to kind of explain this away after the war, they would say, look at the United States. They've sterilized dozens of thousands of people. Why would you point your finger at us when they have their own problems? And so this was also a huge hurdle after the war in trying to hold folks responsible, because then you had to demonstrate it was experimental, not routinized. But he did try to routinize at the end of the war. Klaubeck did. So these are some of the ways they would try and navigate this and the implications for medicine and human ethics. But yeah, it still nevertheless changed the field entirely.
I have a question.
Sure.
There was a novel that came out a few years ago called Lilac Girls. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but I have heard of it.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you if you thought the description of the experiments in Ravensbrück, if the descriptions were accurate. It seemed like it was a very well-researched book, and I just wondered your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but once I do, I'm glad to share my thoughts with you.
Well, a lot of book groups have read it, so
Okay.
a lot of us have some information in our heads that we'll have to see. It was very terrible, so I'm imagining it was accurate.
I'll have to look into it, especially if it's being kind of circulated and read widely. I think it's good for me to read. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that to me.
Follow up, and then once communicate, we can get you back the answer. Thanks, Tiarra. I think anybody else in here? I think we're ready to move forward.
Sure. All right, so to close this slide out, I'll say in the classroom, you can think about how the camps as places of exception, how they were connected to this larger, I guess, like outside world where convention and appearances mattered. Because if you think about Schumann, he entered this place of exception by way of a euthanasia center, right? So the unacceptable things happening in the outside world, that was his pathway to this place of exception. And some of the medicine, for instance, practiced in the camps informed that outside of the camps in gynecology, colposcopies, etc. But they informed each other, and so that could also be a conversation that you open up in the classroom: is the connection, like what purpose did the camp serve for the larger Nazi Germany, and what was the relationship like between the two? I mean, one could also say, you know, even as a visual, you know, camps weren't hidden. Buchenwald, right, was right outside the center of Weimar. Um, People would see, you know, prisoners in their uniforms doing street work in their striped uniforms. So, I mean, people saw it, they were exposed to it, but I digress. That could be a whole nother lecture. The relationship between camps and the larger German society or German country. So here is Karl Klauberg. He was known as the professor. He is, and bear with me here, he was described as short, overweight, balding. This is important for survivors after the war in identifying the perpetrator, because they were never introduced to these men with first names, you know, like, hi, I'm Carl. They had no idea who their name was. They would hear from other people. And so there were some folks who, like in Ravensbrück, where sterilization was very quick and you know, kind of seamless, that they would describe him, and that was how they were able to identify him and especially differentiate him from Schumann, who was this kind of tall, muscular military figure. He was famous in the 20s for his discovery of these synthetic hormones. He was known for optimizing women's fertility, and he actually helped a wife of an SS officer, become fertile and become pregnant. And so Himmler approached him and said, hey, if you can fix fertility, I'm positive you can destroy it too. And that was the logic on which he was recruited to do these experiments. And that was in 41. So for the next year or so, they corresponded about the costs, the resources he'd need, the number of women that he would need, etc. See here. So the method, there were kind of 3 steps to the method. And without getting too overtly, you know, medical or jargony, what his sterilization was causing a woman's fallopian tubes to become so irritated and inflamed that they would scar and seal shut, and therefore an egg couldn't pass through them and a woman couldn't become pregnant. That was like the larger picture of what he was doing. And so first he would try to determine, are the fallopian tubes clear for my material to travel through them? So he'd first inject a contrasting fluid and do an X-ray and see if the fluid went to the end. And he would say, okay, it's clear. I can put my stuff in. This person is eligible for the experiment. The second step would be injecting a caustic substance that would immediately cause burning in women. They cried, screamed, vomited. Many of them had fever. Some passed away, but it would travel through. He would call them back in a few weeks' time and put another contrasting fluid in, and then see if they were shut then. And if they were shut, then he considered it a success. The picture you see here is Renee Dure, and she had about a 7-minute cameo in a Red Cross film called Traces. And this was advertising the International Tracing Service, the central database that Holocaust users use to locate family, friends, etc. So she's holding up here an X-ray of her uterus. She had contrasting fluid put in after the war to see what was closed and what wasn't, what was damaged. And so you can see here in the center, this is the contrasting fluid. And you can see this white line on the side, and that shows you that the contrast fluid went through her fallopian tubes. So this side was not fully damaged. The other one, which is fully dark, is. This allowed her to have a daughter, Nomi, who now lives, I believe, still in San Francisco. But so she had a daughter. So this is her. She was she spoke frequently about her experiences. We'll see her face in a moment. But are there any questions about this, about the Klauberg method? And it's quite invasive and traumatic, of course, and I think too the optics of a giant needle, which weren't necessarily used to puncture human flesh, but to enter through the cervix. But it was a quite sizable needle. And when Klauberg was brought to trial, which he never actually saw trial, he was arrested. He sat in prison waiting for trial and died. Yep. Just to give you an idea, he sterilized around 500 to 600 women, depending on the transport, which we'll see in a moment. But it looks like we have a question, Amani. Oh, maybe not.
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
sorry.
I'm sorry. I just had a quick question. I'm sorry if you said it or maybe I missed it. The solution that he put in that, was burning and he was trying to use for the, to scar them, is it something that he just mixed up himself, taking a whole bunch of different random chemicals? Is this something that already, was already created and he just decided, this may work for what I'm needing it for? How did the solution come about?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. It's a really great question.
Mm-hmm.
He learned that formalin, when he was testing on animals before he went to Auschwitz, he learned that formalin could be effective in what he was trying to do. And the proportion of different ingredients, which he kept a secret, he didn't want anyone to steal his invention.
Mm-hmm.
These different amounts, he tinkered with them to see what would be most effective. But very importantly, he was employed by Schering, and that's a company that produced pharmaceuticals, hormones. They would be affiliated with Bayer, like Bayer
Okay.
aspirin.
Uh-huh.
And so he got funding through them. So he would get the ingredients from them free of charge because he was one of their employees. And then he would make his own concoction, which he kept private. But we know from shipments of formalin and some other bits to Auschwitz, we can kind of surmise what was in some of them. And so he started putting a contrasting agent into the chemicals to help him visualize it on an X-ray. But yeah, does that answer a little bit?
Yes, it does.
Sure.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I was like, yeah, he got them from Schering, mixed them himself. He kept it a secret. He also had an assistant, Johannes Goebel from Schering, who would also accompany him later to Auschwitz to do the experiments. Interestingly, Goebel had a heart attack, and so Schering said, he's too much of a liability to keep in the office, so you can take him to Auschwitz with you. And he was a chemist by trade, not a physician in any measure. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure. Yeah.
Did any of these companies have even an inkling of what their products might be used for? And if so, did they ever face any justice after the war?
It depends on which pharmaceutical company, and their claim was that they didn't know what was happening, and that they weren't distributed. They didn't distribute these under the pretense that they would be used for humans. So, a good example might be, Siemens provided, Siemens is the number one manufacturer of large appliances and whatnot in Germany still today. And they supply the X-ray machines that were used in Auschwitz and elsewhere, actually. But they provided them. When they were contacted after the war, they said, we had no way of knowing, because the camp got the X-ray machines under the pretense of treating cancer, which is hogwash, we know, but that was the pretense that they said they needed it for. Um, uh, it, yeah, sharing was not held responsible. I'm not sure if Bayer was. I know Bayer rented prisoners for experiments because it would help benefit their company. So they paid for the human subjects. It really varied, and it varied their level of involvement. Sharing said once they delivered some of the chemicals instead of to Klauberg's gynecological office outside as a civilian, he had it delivered to Auschwitz. And once Sharing saw that, they put up a stink and they said, you're going to implicate us.
Thank you.
Which is interesting. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I'll move forward. All right, so the settings. So here you'll see a map of the major concentration camps. There were many, many, many camps. And there were the larger camps, and then there were a number of satellite camps at each one. Well, most of the larger ones had plenty of satellite camps, and this is where they also, for instance, manufacturers could say, hey, we want cheap labor from you, VW, we want you to produce this. Can we set up X, Y, and Z near your camp here? So these were a lot of the larger camps that you can see. And so I'm wondering if anyone can kind of take a guess. Why do you think Auschwitz and why Ravensbrück? Why do you think these might be the places where experimental sterilizations were taking place, or did take place, or could take place? Any guesses?
I've got somebody who.
Sure.
I could be wrong, but it looks like both of them are in somewhat centralized locations, because it looks like Auschwitz is right at the center of that area, and then Ravensbrück is at the top center, but it's not far from a port. So if they needed more supplies, it'd be easier to get them to. But Ravensbrück, especially, it's farther away than all the others. Like it's up to the north. So if something went amiss, they might be able to elude discovery. And Auschwitz obviously has its own reputation, so they were less likely to have people that cared that came to inspect it, or people that would ask too many questions. So I think isolation for one and central location for the other. They're probably on railway lines too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, there's no one something pointing to why, but we can make some guesses. And one of them is that Auschwitz was, for all intents and purposes, massive. It was massive. In addition to all of the sub camps, not to say that everyone passed through Auschwitz, that's not true, but it was a sorting place for many folks who were in the camp system during a certain period of time. But it was just such a large place that there was an absolute abundance of biological human material. So for Auschwitz, it made sense that there were so many humans there that they could use some of those for these experiments. Ravensbrück, they had doctors there who conducted kind of conventional sterilizations with the law, right? The 1933 law. So they would fulfill that order for sterilization in the camp, but use normal conventional methods. We have some inklings that someone, Percival-Treite, may have played with his own method a little bit, but the real experiments happen after Klauberg leaves Auschwitz, and he continues on to Ravensbrück and teaches other physicians how to do his injection method. He tries to say it's routinized now. We have a good idea of how to do it. Let me show you how to do it so you too can do it to all the women that pass through. And so there's around, from what we know, like 100 experimental sterilizations in the fall of 44 when he's making that move to Ravensbrück. And then in like January, February, we estimate between like 200 and 400 women in succession. So he was trying to say, like, look, I developed it, I did this thing, you two can do it too. So the context of that is that Klauberg was leaving Auschwitz at the end of 44 because they were losing the war. Soviets were coming in. I'll show you on the map. So Auschwitz right here, this is in, you can't see the lines here, but this is in southern Poland. And so Soviets would liberate them on what, the 27th of January. But long story short, he progressed on to Ravensbrück because the Reich, the German Reich, was contracting. All these death marches, are folks familiar with death marches? So everything was contracting. So they were telling folks, okay, march back into Germany proper with prisoners. And I think an ideological reason might be that they were Geheimnisträger, or they had secrets that they could tell, and therefore they needed to be protected. But a more practical reason is that Himmler was hoping to use the prisoners to either sell or swap for prisoners of war. So even at the end of the war, Himmler was trying to sell concentration camp prisoners to the Allies. So he was using them as pawns. So that's kind of like the greater reason why in their kind of contraction back into Germany proper, they marched all these prisoners along with them. And Auschwitz was in Poland. Ravensbrück was in Germany proper. So that's one reason. They're contracting. So he went to the next best thing, but also it was the only all women's camp. And so he was hoping, Klauberg was hoping to continue doing this to women. He hadn't worked on infertility or sterilization with men. So he proceeded on to the women's camp. That was initially, before all of this, where Himmler had wanted him to do the experiments, was the women's camp. And Klauberg said, it's not close enough to home. I live in Königshütte. Let me go to Auschwitz instead. And they let him. Any questions about this so far? No? Okay.
No, I think we're good.
Right.
We're okay.
So victims and survivors. So Auschwitz, what I want to point out here, which is really relevant for all of you, is that when the experiments started the very beginning, they were in Birkenau, which was kind of the women's camp version of Auschwitz. Long story short, I mean, to oversimplify this grossly, was the women's camp, right? They took up a block that had there was chicken wire instead of fence, there was mud, there was no running water, there was no electricity. The heat they needed to bring firewood in, it was just really, really primitive, and it was not well equipped for what they were doing. The women that were selected piecemeal for this were actually many of the women that were on the 999 transport. So I want to dovetail this back into the film that you watched. Some of those were the women that were first taken into Block 30. Because the conditions were poor, Christmas that year, so Christmas of 42, Klauberg toured Auschwitz, the men's camp, which had brick buildings from the it used to be a military installation. So there were brick buildings there. So he's like, all right, they have running water, they have power, they have everything I need. So he started in Block 10. And that's when he started culling women from transports to bring them into the block. So you have women selected from transports from, Greece, the Netherlands, France, Belgium. And so those are the women that come in. What's really important about that is that they were so different, right? You have 4, 5, 600 women from different countries, different languages, different religious backgrounds, different class backgrounds, vastly different. And so they come in and, I mean, they're brought together under the pretense of what was happening to them, but most of them, if they did forge friendships, which many did, it was along national and language lines because they needed to be able to communicate with each other. Then at the end of the less than a year, the end of the war, they moved on to Block 1, which was a new construction in Auschwitz, and that's where they stayed until they evacuated the camp. In Ravensbrück, we have Romani women predominantly sterilized under the pretenses of this law, so it wasn't experimental. But then once Klauberg came at the end of the war, it was in succession, and it was Romani women, Polish, Russian, a great number from various backgrounds were just kind of ushered in like a production line. Any questions about this? I would add that the women in Auschwitz were, although they were very different in, their national background, religious ones, etc., they were all Jewish. They were all Jewish. Ravensbrück, it was a diverse group of folks that were subjected to this. It was much more heterogeneous. All right, so we'll move on to survivor voices, which is more of my favorite part. So I was hoping for all of you. So because there were hundreds of women who were sterilized, many of whom have not talked about their experiences, out of those who have, things appear in so many different languages, and it's really hard to find out where they are, who they are, etc. So I'm hoping this provides kind of a starting point if you want to bring this into your classroom. And especially with the USC Shoah Foundation, that's the largest repository of Holocaust testimony in the world. And when someone just mentions sterilization or experiments in their testimony, it gets tagged as such, even if they weren't a part of it. So if you yourself go on to the USC Shoah Foundation and you type in experiments, like thousands of things will pop up. So it's hard to see who is actually impacted by that personally. So I'm hoping that this provides a starting point for folks with at least the audio visual. So for the written accounts, you might find this interesting. Garmain Pichon, she was a Greek Jewish woman. She actually lived in Florida for many decades and passed away in Florida a few years back. But she wrote a book called Undaunted. Margot 47574 is the story of Margot de Wilde. And that is actually written with a classroom in mind. And so even though it was written by someone with a PhD, they structure the questions and kind of intersperse the chapters so that students can engage with what she's saying and what she's doing with this book. Criminal Experiments on Human Beings was edited by Lori Shelley, and that has 20 women's voices from different parts in Block 10 and the surrounding laboratories. So there is a section for the women who were sterilized. What's nice about that is that she brings them all into dialogue, and so that you yourself or your students can read through some shorter or longer personal accounts. The last one here, Elsa's story. This focuses less on sterilization, although she was sterilized in Ravensbrück in the fall of 1944 when she was 12. But she's half Romani, and that was the reason why she was brought to the camps. She was adopted by an Aryan family. When the state found out that she was half Romani, they arrested her and brought her at 12 to Auschwitz. Actually, she was 11 then, to Auschwitz. And then she was transferred to Ravensbrück, where she was sterilized. Her family petitioned, and in the fall of 44, they had her released from Ravensbrück, and she went home. She moved to the UK later in life, got married, and she's shared her sterilization in some contexts and not in others. So it's not a focal point of this book, but she was sterilized. And the age group for Elsa's story is 9 to 12. So just as full transparency. Oh, disappeared either way. These audiovisual selections are all from women deported from the Netherlands. Renee During here, she's German Jew, but in fleeing, her family fled. They first went to the Netherlands. That's where she was deported from. So these 6 are ones that your students can watch in English. And there's a documentary here called Block 10 that came out, 6 years ago. That's also a collection of women being interviewed, talking about the experiments, etc. And you have some scholars in there talking about human experiments, the Nazi regime, etc. So it frames it really nicely. That might be a good introduction if that's something that you want to incorporate into your classroom or talk about. So now looking to pedagogy and how we can engage students with this material if you choose to do so, because I don't think it's for every classroom and every condition. It takes definitely some emotional maturity to be able to engage with and work with this material. So when we think about younger age groups, I think it's more about familiarizing them with the fact that these things happened. And then with older age groups, really parsing and pulling apart these pieces to understand what we can learn from this. So for preteens, you can ask them about, so if you assigned one of these testimonies or a memoir, asking them, how does the survivor describe their life? Right? And for many, which I didn't write here, but between us, for many, right, there's the before, a during, and an after, which is also what structures audiovisual testimonies too, right? The before, the during, and the after. And if the goal is to develop students' empathy and their connection to fellow human beings in this, looking at the Florida mandate for Holocaust education, kind of tapping into empathy and interpersonal communication and connection, having them acknowledge and recognize these emotions in others, seeing the impact, right, as a survivor shows it to them. And then if we were to kind of delve deeper with older students, thinking about, okay, so this testimony is periodized before, during, and after. Why might this be necessary? Right? What purpose does this serve? And also, how might that not be organic for some? And what I'm thinking of very specifically is that survivors might, without outside guidance or bumpers, might flip back and forth between now and then. Right now and then. And, I talked to my son the other day about what happened at, Ravensbrück. And when I was there, I did X, Y, and Z. And so for someone's memory, it's not necessarily like this one tale that you tell. That's something that you learn and practice from sharing your experiences so many times, right? And there's a time aspect to it too, which is the past kind of seeps into the present and doesn't allow that person to live fully in the present. Does this make sense? So they're kind of in their mind living in the past, but their physical body is in the present moment. And so something really interesting happens with time. And you could also incorporate sterilization and children into that conversation, right? A lot of USC Showa testimonies, folks bring children in at the end. And it's almost like this handing of the baton to a next generation, like, okay, now it's your memory to carry. So getting students to think critically about who's carrying memory, why bring children in, and what might this say about folks who don't have children to show? So just some questions that can kind of get gears turning for both the Holocaust, study of the Holocaust, but also how we can think about these experiments and infertility ultimately for Holocaust survivors. So this I won't, so to say, beat a dead horse. But in thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, it really got me thinking, how can these Nazi human experiments, like how can we present this in these different strata in useful ways? And of course, there's different exercises and things that you can do with these concepts, but at its core, thinking about this progression from recognizing what's happening or why it was happening in the regime, what purpose did it serve, um, and then also, depending on students' level, historically situating, contextualizing, and narrating how complex this Nazi machine was. And then for evaluation at the very top, I would posit thinking about how the state and medicine work together or against each other, vis-a-vis state prerogatives, right? Reproduction and the nation state. And so there are two items here which have an array of women's voices, right? Kind of a compilation, if you will. So the edited volume from Laurie Shelley has many women's different voices, and the documentary features women from different backgrounds and languages, etc., sharing their experiences. So in thinking about how students can engage with this, definitely emphasizing compare and contrast. You know, you can make this messy comparison, but definitely not a competition, but rather looking at how these experiences may have been different, right? And so having students think about whether they watch the film or read the edited volume, some of those chapters, about how different women were and how different their responses were. So this act may have united them, but in many ways they were very different, vastly different, and a lot of them responded in different ways. But what it also gets students to do on an emotional level and on a level of empathy is to think about difference and how folks are impacted differently, though in situations like this, near ubiquitously is it negative, right? But it gets folks thinking about different experiences, different perspectives, and different traumatizations. And so having students connect with that by reading something personal, written, or spoken by that survivor themselves. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's two more things. One I can show. So depending on how advanced the classroom is in age and what you're covering, etc., some other topics that you could bridge this to bring it into dialogue with include settler politics, right? We mentioned a little bit about reproduction, reproductive control, and land in the state. That could be one direction you go. Another is thinking about hierarchies of human life. So some folks were attributed such little value that they could be disposed of. Others, you know, it was designed for them to be infertile, but to still be living. And then at the very top, you know, so looking at how this is stratified, excuse me, for the nation state. And how we could even see these different hierarchies in different contexts today, not necessarily in a medical field, but say a legal field, say in regards to, say, gender, etc., but thinking about these different hierarchies. Nature culture, this is probably a little bit more advanced, so not so much with K through 12. If you are a college educator, this might be definitely something that you could bridge into. So I won't kind of delve into that right now. Reproduction, nation building that dovetails into settler politics, as I mentioned. And so I have here about a 1.5-minute clip just to give you a very brief preview of the film, The Untold Story of Block 10, just to give you a glimpse for a 1.5 minutes, about 90 seconds. So let me see here. Can everyone see this screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. All right. So I will play it on my end. Again, it's less than a 1.5 minutes. And then we will wrap up and answer any questions folks have. But just to show you this film a little bit, it is a documentary. It is available on most academic streaming sites. So I'll go ahead and play this now.
Einspritzungen in die Gebärmutter vorgenommen würden. Ich habe Ihnen gegenüber aber das Wort Sterilisation niemals gebraucht. Von meinen Laborantinnen aus Königshütte habe ich niemand in das Lager Auschwitz mitgenommen. Lediglich einmal war meine Sekretärin Frau Geier mitgefahren, damit sie das Milieu dort kennenlerne. Sie sollte mal sehen, wie die Frauen in Block 10 an mir hängen. Ich habe einmal auch meine 3-jährige Tochter mitgenommen.
Und der hat sogar bezahlt, den Nazis, damit man uns nicht vergasst. Der Dr. Klauberg bezahlt 50 Pfennig am Tag für seine Versuchskaninchen.
Und dann wird einfach, diese ganzen Operationen werden mit Spinalanästhesie gemacht. Also es ist keine Vollnarkose. Die Frauen, denen wird nicht erzählt, was da passiert. Die sind auf einmal dann gefühllos, wie gelähmt vom Becken abwärts, wissen gar nicht, was ihnen passiert, wissen nicht, ob das reversibel ist, kriegen aber geistig mit, was da passiert. Es muss eine Traumatisierung sein, die man kaum ermessen kann.
Mais on était complètement ignorants, on était des jeunes femmes. On ne savait absolument pas. Allez savoir ce que c'est qu'un utérus, allez savoir. On était à 1000 lieues de pensée, et c'est pas les infirmières de Glauberg qui pouvaient nous mettre au courant, elles étaient aussi ignorantes que nous.
Die zegt, we gaan allemaal experimenten met jullie doen. En de bedoeling is dat je geen kinderen kunt krijgen. En dat hebben ze goed gedaan op hun manier.
There we go. So, oh. There we go. So that's just a brief snippet, but if students were to watch that, they can see really the diversity of backgrounds of women that were sterilized in the block. And actually, out of the larger number of women sterilized, about 40 went on to have children organically. Much to their surprise, almost all the women that I've come across who did give birth weren't trying. They just assumed that it was effective. And then usually there was some condition with bloating or feeling sick, and a physician would confirm, like, yes, you are pregnant. But I mean, having said that, Klauberg was also pretty ineffective if sterilization was the final goal, which I mean, is a good thing that he was so ineffective. So in closing, instead of folks clicking on this, and the questions that I was going to ask were, what is something that you'll bring with you? And anything that you wish could have been incorporated or done differently. And actually, we can keep it more of like a dialogue between us all. and share what are some of your key takeaways or what are things that could have strengthened this for you?
Okay, if anybody wants to unmute online or anybody that's in here, I've got
I was just going to say I appreciated hearing about the women that were able to go on and thought that they were sterilized but weren't. So, I mean, that's a
Yeah.
positive.
For sure, absolutely.
And hold on, I've got real quick.
We do also have quite a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure if we
It's not the Zoom chat, Tiarra. It's
answered them.
in Whova.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we answered them already, so I'll just run through a couple of them. Can you comment on the role and experience of Gisela Pearl in Auschwitz? Is one of them.
Gisela Pearl. She briefly saw what was happening in Block 10, and she went on to be a gynecologist and help women give birth. What was her phrase? It was, I took so many children out of the world that I'll only bring them in now. But she wrote the book, I Was the Doctor in Auschwitz, but she was only there very briefly. I don't think she ever worked full-time in Block 10, but she was a fascinating woman, and her book is fantastic. Definitely recommend it.
Awesome. We have one from Holly that says, why do the doctors and physicians not face the same punishments as other Nazi collaborators?
So why didn't they face the same consequence?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So if you think about the Nuremberg trials, right? Even though the first trial was called the medical trial, the trials more generally were to demonstrate war crimes, and it wasn't really, they weren't seeking to demonstrate that Nazis committed crimes against their own people, but rather other nations and other transgressions of international law. When it came to medicine, no one was ever brought to trial for sterilizations. Like Schumann was brought for his role in murder. And Klauberg at the time, they had gotten enough victim statements to try and have a trial for him. But when he was arrested, it wasn't for his sterilizations. It was because he threatened his wife and child, and they, as a preemptive measure, put him in prison beforehand. They never faced much of anything. But I think a part of that too is that they were pawning off sterilization more specifically as a non-experimental method, but also in line with what the United States and many other countries were practicing. And so in that way, they really normalized it, and that helped them evade culpability.
All right. And then I have two that are kind of connected. So one is, what physiological and physical impacts did women subjected to experimental sterilization in concentration camps endure, and how do these experiences shape post-war narratives of survival and justice? And then another one asking about what were the kind of, besides those, what were the consequences of the sterilization on these women?
Yeah, those are both really great and really big questions. So in terms of physical and physiological impacts of sterilization specifically, really depended on the person. And that's right when we get to revisit how wildly different these women were. Some folks were, I guess, plagued their whole lives with what had happened for good reason. And other folks, not so much. So it really depended on the person entirely. I can say that a lot of the women who did give birth after the experiments, or even if they weren't subjected to them, a lot of them have conceptualized having children as revenge or success, or in some cases, redemption. So it really, some folks really felt like justice was served when a perpetrator was imprisoned or murdered. For other folks, having a child was enough justice for them that, like, you know, I won, you didn't. You tried to kill me, I didn't die. You know, another generation lives. And I mean, if you were in a early DP camp, it could have been assaulting or murdering a Nazi or a guard. Really just depended on the person, but a lot of women in particular conceptualize children as revenge.
Wow. And I apologize if these are already been answered because these are they were asked throughout the entire presentation. So were sterilizations performed at many or most concentration camps, or was it kind of a select few?
So the experimental ones were at Auschwitz-Birkenau and Ravensbrück. Conventional sterilizations, however, took place all over. Because the 1933 law essentially listed it listed a host of reasons for someone to be sterilized, including some blanketed reasons like asocial, which is very undefined, right? Someone who had two children from two different men, who is a woman and a single mother, could be called asocial because they don't like what she's doing, and then be sterilized for that. So it really depends, but the camps themselves became sites of sterilization authorized by the law outside, and then they were going to use them for labor anyways, so conducted those in the revere or, you know, medical facility, however elusive that word seems, wherever, in whichever camp, under really gross conditions, but they happened all over, but the experiments in particular were at those two.
Dr. Maznick, we heard a lot about Klauberg and Schumann, the MDs. What about the medical team around, the nurses, the assistants, the anesthesiologists? If the biggies got away, were there any of the lower echelon prosecuted? Sorry for that slip. Did the nurses, are there any acts of resistance amongst the nurses, empathy, help, assistance, or were they ever legally made responsible for their acts?
No.
Nothing.
No, and in Block 10 too, I think there was, in terms of some of the staff that work there, there was some revolving door. And what I'm thinking is that the SS women, the auxiliaries, because they couldn't, when they were pregnant, they couldn't be doing like full labor in the camp, right? They would put the women into Block 10 because then they could just sit down and watch all the women inside. And so there was like this array of pregnant SS women kind of parked around watching these going-ons. But from what I understand, none of the nurses, anyone like that was held responsible. But then again, if they took part in something more reprehensible than they would be, right? Like Hedda Oberhauser and some others were held responsible, but a lot of nurses weren't. It really depended. Like the level of their transgression, but what's really interesting is there was a lab doctor who worked in the lab connected to Block 10, and he arrived when he came to work there, arrived with his wife and his child, and brought the child. I mean, like there are some accounts on women's arrival that there were a couple small children playing outside of Block 10, which is unfathomable to think about children playing in the camp. If anyone's seen Zone of Interest, that might give you an idea of what that might have looked like, children at the camp.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Of the 40 or so women who gave birth after the experiments were done, were there any birth defects on or any negative ramifications from the experiments?
Not that I've come across. There was one woman who was a prisoner functionary and a nurse, Sylvia Vesela, and she did not want to ever become pregnant because she was scared of birth defects because of the experiments, but never gave birth. She had an abortion at one point, but never gave birth. But all the other women, from what they've shared, none have mentioned that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? But rather they haven't told us anything about that.
Kayla, is there anything else online?
Did I miss any questions, my online friends? I think we got them all. I mean, we have kind of a comment here from Stephen about, he keeps coming back to the question of why. Why did doctors think this was prudent? Why did they not see these young women as human? Why did the Nazi regime think this is the answer? So I think that's more of a, him just in awe of what he's learned. So.
And I'll add too for folks, if you're ever searching for a source, or if you have questions, if you want to know a little bit more about something to feel more confident about bringing it into the classroom, anything like that, I am free of charge, open ears, and always happy to talk with folks and support what you do in the classroom. Yeah, so definitely open for questions. Anything you might have via email. Yeah, please be in touch. Don't be shy, and I'm happy to chat with folks. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much for everything. Here are our applause. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you for your time and for giving us your time this afternoon. And I'll be reaching out afterwards, but I appreciate you joining us and for everything that you gave us for the presentation and everything. So have a great afternoon, and I'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thank you, folks.
Thank
Be
you.
safe and be well.
Okay.